Good evening, Zach.
Good evening, Mr. Marcus. How are you?
Doing great, thanks. So good to see you.
So, everyone, we're just going to wait like 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we're going to get started. All right, everyone, I think we're going to get started. So, everyone, welcome to the Gen Z Jews Fighting Anti-Semitism's Winter Speaker Series. Today, our guest is Kenneth L. Marcus, who is the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the Department of Education, and now is the founder and now chairman of the Brandeis Center. We are very lucky to have him here today. Before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you to Combat Anti-Semitism and Capital Jewish Museum for their help and support on this summit. So, college campuses have been seeing an increase in anti-Semitism, both on the left and the right, for a long time. According to ADL, there has been an 86% increase of anti-Semitism on college campuses. In a slightly outdated 2015 Brandeis University report, for students who had some affiliation about Israel, more than a quarter of those undergraduates responded about being talked hostilely towards about Israel on campus by their peers and they thought of it as a very big problem. And nearly 15% of the same level of hostility was just towards Jews. So, nearly 1/3 of these undergraduate respondents report having been verbally harassed in the past year because they were just Jewish. And nearly 3/4 of these respondents have been exposed at one time during the past year to at least one of 6 or so anti-Semitic statements. These stats have most likely only grown since the survey back in 2015. So while we will not be getting very deep into these next 2 topics, they're still very important to know about. Last August at USC, the Vice President of Undergraduate Student Government, Rose Rich, resigned from her government seat. In her resignation letter, Rose described the intense pressure and toxic conditions that led to her decision, specifically the anti-Semitic attacks on her character and the online harassment that she had endured because of her Jewish and Zionist identities. In April of 2019 at Emory University, Jewish students had mock eviction notices on their dorm room doors. And even before Charlottesville and the rise in white supremacy, Nazi symbols have been seen on college campuses with swastikas sprayed on Jewish fraternities. Today, we will examine these general ideas of anti-Semitism on college campuses more closely with Assistant Marcus. Mr. Marcus, take the floor.
Thank you, Zach. It is such an honor to be speaking to Gen Z Jews. I've spoken to a lot of audiences, including college audiences, but Gen Z, of course, is a generation that includes high school students like yourself, as well as college students. And I'm so impressed that high school students are beginning to think of these issues already and how they can be prepared for colleges that they might enter in the future. 20 years ago when I started working on civil rights issues, it certainly didn't occur to me that I would be dealing in a serious way with anti-Semitism. I was aware of anti-Semitism as a Jewish American, and I thought of it as a historical problem. I knew that there had been significant college anti-Semitism matters. that there had been restrictions. Members of my family had been prevented from getting into universities because they were Jewish. But this seemed like a historical problem. And I believed that America had made significant progress against anti-Semitism on college campuses pretty much every year since the end of the Second World War through at least the turn of this new century. And yet we can no longer say that we're making progress. The last 2 decades, since approximately the start of the Second Intifada, have really seen backsliding. They have seen a worsening of the situation, as you've indicated in your introduction with the statistics that you've quoted and also some of the examples that you've given. We're no longer in a situation where we're making progress. I don't think it's a situation that requires alarm, but it is a situation that requires action. It seems to me that students often make 2 kinds of problems when they're thinking about anti-Semitism. One is to ignore or understate the problem. Oftentimes they'll shrug it off. They won't go to lectures like this, or they'll think, well, maybe it happens to some people, but it doesn't happen to me. And yet the problem has been spreading fairly rapidly, often onto campuses that had seemed just a few years ago to be immune to it. The other problem is to overstate the problem or to be excessively alarmed by it. The fact is that most Jewish American college students are able to have a healthy and happy college experience. We do not have the kinds of restrictions on Jewish admissions that we used to have. And Jewish students have lots of different kinds of opportunities at many excellent colleges and universities. Hillel programs and Chabad programs, and in some places, access to a wide variety of Jewish studies and Israel studies programs, for example. And yet, over the last few years, the number of incidents that have been happening have been more and more worrisome, and the trend is not looking good. The sorts of examples that you cited could be found at many, many different colleges and universities today. And the fact that things are getting worse should be of significant long-term concern when we think about how bad anti-Semitism has gotten in some parts of the past. We really see 3 different kinds of anti-Semitism on college campus. There's right-wing, there's left-wing, and there's Muslim or Islamist anti-Semitism. The right-wing anti-Semitism can include the sorts of swastika incidents that you mentioned. Oftentimes, they seem to be based on non-college students, people coming from outside. It can be swastikas, it can be destruction of menorahs, it can be arson in some cases, or other sorts of vandalism. This is increasing and it's worrisome, and it's a matter that I think requires heightened security and training for law enforcement, including university law enforcement. But the left wing and Muslim anti-Semitism often focuses on Israel or Zionism, sometimes as a pretext for focusing on Jews, and sometimes as a focus of traditional anti-Jewish defamations. So for instance, we've seen the so-called blood libel used in discussions of Israel. That is the medieval slur in which Jews were accused of using the blood of murdered Christian children for ceremonial purposes. This slur in medieval times inevitably led to murder of Jewish people throughout Europe. And here again in the United States, we will sometimes see versions of the blood libel that are used in conversations and debates about Israel, often followed by targeting of Jewish students for some sort of abuse. There are different sorts of situations in which we see it a lot. The most well-known might be the so-called BDS, or boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. That's where anti-Israel groups will form in order to try to boycott or divest from the university's relationship with Israel. That too often becomes an excuse for anti-Jewish stereotypes and defamations. But whether it does or it doesn't, it is based on treating Israel different than any other country in the world. When double standards are used for Israel, or where Israel is delegitimized or demonized, oftentimes what we're thinking of is something other than just political dispute. These are ancient anti-Jewish approaches that are simply adopted in the modern age in a fight against Zionism. It's not political only. It is, in a sense, an attack on an aspect of Jewish identity, and it is a serious harm to Jewish students. But there are other aspects that we're also seeing increasingly nowadays. One of them is anti-normalization, efforts by usually left-wing organizations to exclude pro-Israel campus organizations or to exclude Jewish students who refuse to disassociate from Israel. So one might see, for instance, a Know Your Rights event in which students are told they can't participate if they are associated with Hillel or other Jewish organizations. Many Jewish students are politically progressive and may want to involve themselves in social justice activities on campus. But frequently, those students are specifically being excluded unless they are willing to disavow an aspect of their Jewish identity. This anti-normalization and exclusion is happening in many colleges and universities and is especially harmful to Jewish students who are, in a sense, made to decide what aspect of their Jewish identity they want to express. Other students are able to fully express their identity. Jewish students, not always. Another thing that we find frequently is silencing or censorship, and it's very closely related. It's Jewish voices not being heard, being silenced. It may involve refusals to invite Israeli or pro-Israel speakers to campus. Or if Jewish organizations invite Israeli speakers, sometimes the speakers are heckled or otherwise prevented from speaking. Sometimes Jewish students are silenced in various ways. For instance, told that they can participate in student government. You mentioned the Rose Rich situation, but she's not the only one. There have been a few situations in which Jewish students have been accused of bias if they support the Jewish state. This is not bias. This is an aspect of their Jewish identity as they see it. And when they are silenced, when they are prevented from having their voices heard, they are not only being prevented from living fully Jewish lives, but the entire campus is prevented from hearing an important voice that should be heard. So these are what we are facing more and more. The good news is that while we are seeing increases of anti-Semitic activity from the left and the right on college campuses, we're also seeing stronger pushback from Jewish students and from the Jewish community. There are now far more organizations that are fighting campus anti-Semitism now than they were 20 years ago when I first started working on the issue. Certainly the Louis D. Brandeis Center, which I run, didn't exist 20 years ago, but the Brandeis Center fights campus anti-Semitism through law, sometimes filing legal complaints to protect Jewish students from discrimination and harassment. But there are other organizations. I mentioned Hillel and Chabad as campus organizations, but there are a number of organizations that are now working to address the problem. Zach, I've got a lot more to say, but I want to leave time for questions, and so I think I'm going to leave it at that for now, and maybe engage with the ideas and questions that I know that you have.
Awesome. So why does anti-Semitism stick to college campuses so heavily?
My friend, the late Abigail Thernstrom, the vice chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, once called American universities islands of intolerance in a sea of reason. And of course, she was being ironic, but somewhat bitterly ironic, because we expect universities to be oases of a reason and liberal tolerance. And they are for some, but not for others. Oftentimes, universities may be tolerant for some minorities, but pick and choose. It is often the progressive aspect of college campuses which has led to anti-Israelism and then anti-Semitism. In some cases, it might be the desire of progressive faculty members or students to side with what they perceive to be the less powerful. At any rate, over the years, and it's now been several years, Israel has become unpopular with campus elements who may not be a majority, but who are disproportionately influential. From any study that I have seen, university faculty and students are not all anti-Semitic. In fact, like the American public, attitudes towards Jewish people on college campuses tend to be generally favorable. In fact, attitudes towards Jewish Americans on college campuses tend to be as favorable as towards pretty much any other religious group. So it's not as if college campuses are filled with hate towards Jewish people. However, there are on many college campuses a small but vocal and disproportionately influential minority of people who are both anti-Semitic and deeply hostile towards Israel. And they have tended to have an unusual amount of influence and to be responsible for a large number of incidents.
So do you think that people maybe are just not caring about anti-Semitism on college campuses, and that's the reason for its growth?
Yes and no. Yes and no. I think that there are some people who think that they care about all forms of bias and hate, including anti-Semitism, but they really don't know what anti-Semitism is. They might be concerned if they see a swastika, for instance. They might be alarmed if they see white supremacists on campus. But if they see truly vile anti-Zionist literature on campus, they may not realize that this is not just political criticism, that there is demonization, that there is delegitimization, that there are double standards involved. They may not realize that this is something that needs to be treated like other forms of bias. And that is why I would say one of the most important things that's needed on college campuses is a broader acceptance of the so-called IRA, or International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which spells out in its guiding examples the ways in which frequently anti-Israel activity is in fact a form of anti-Semitism.
And do you think like that, my bad, sorry, why do you think this issue seems to go nearly unheard of in the mainstream media?
That's a very good question, Zach, because there really have not been the sorts of articles about anti-Semitism that you see or about other sorts of bias. Every once in a while, there will be an incident that rises to the level that it captures some editors, but it's usually not what the major mainstream editors are looking for. And when there is an incident, it is often a hard sell to convince them to cover the matter. It's simply not what they're focused on. There are certain narratives that have established themselves and which the major newspapers and magazines and broadcast news have focused on, and that they are willing to treat as legitimate. Black Lives Matter, for instance, is understood by editors, and they will write articles on the horrific problems of abuse of African Americans. But when it comes to anti-Semitism on college campuses, it is not covered, in part because of a perception that Jews are white, privileged, and unneedy of support or assistance, and that this is not a cause that requires help. This is, I think, ignorant both of the history of anti-Semitism and of the extent to which what's happening on college campuses can be so hurtful of Jewish students and so coarsening of the environment for everyone.
And just to our audience, just know that the Q&A section is completely open. We would love to have questions coming in from the audience. So do you like, sorry. So how do we identify the line between pro-Palestine and anti-Semitism?
I'm glad to be seeing questions coming up, and that is a good one. It is important to recognize that there is a line. One can be against anti-Semitism without being against Palestinians or Palestinian Americans. One can hope and wish and pray for the success and prosperity and welfare of all people, including Palestinians and Palestinian Americans, and want to fight anti-Semitism. I gave the IRA definition as I think the best single tool we have. It is not always going to be useful, but I think it is the best single tool that we have available because it does give those examples, and it is based on the so-called 3Ds from the famous Russian refusenik Natan Sharansky. I didn't attribute it, but I mentioned them a moment ago. Ask whether one is talking about the use of double standards towards Israel that are not used for any other group. Ask whether Israel is being demonized, treated not just as being wrong, but as almost demonic. Ask whether it's being delegitimized in the way that historically the Jewish religion was as well. These are not forms of Palestinian solidarity activism. These are expressions of bias and bigotry. There's a very big difference.
So do you think that anti-Semitism on college campuses is, do you think that anti-Semitism on college campuses is being shadowed by things that are considered larger problems in today's society?
Well, I mean, to start with, on college campuses, this is such a difficult time with coronavirus. And I would say that coronavirus and the related aspects, both health and closure, those are overshadowing pretty much everything nowadays. I also think that Black Lives Matter has gotten a great deal of prominence. Society is, in a good way, much more attentive to questions of abuse of police authority and discrimination against African Americans. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism on college campus hasn't just fallen below the top few issues. For many, especially on the campus far left, anti-Semitism is simply not something that they are willing to consider. And they are in particular not willing to consider that anti-Zionism tends to be driven by anti-Jewish animus.
And why do you think that anti-Semitism is worse now on college campuses? And what do you think is behind this recent change?
It's a global phenomenon. What we are seeing is that certainly over the last 20 years, but increasingly in more recent years, that the post-Holocaust protection that Jews have had against socially acceptable bias has sort of disappeared. And in the Middle East first, and then in Europe, and now in North America, one is seeing this resurgence of hatred. It is much worse in the Middle East, significantly worse in Europe, but we are now a much more global society than we ever were before. And as we have global migration, global trade, global communication, global internet, global spread of ideas, some of the negative aspects, the social pathologies like anti-Semitism, are spreading much more than they had before. Fortunately, positive things are spreading as well, and we can hope that there will be more global opposition to anti-Semitism too.
And on just the topic of like bad things spreading, do you think that maybe there's other social movements that have been like spreading bad ideas of anti-Semitism to like around college campuses?
Well, around the world and around the United States, and on both right and the left. So we've certainly seen over the last few months with the far right and the white supremacy movement, the spread over the internet of really horrific anti-Semitic and otherwise racist ideas being spread. But we also see on the left intolerance and bias towards Jews spreading.
And do you believe that colleges should maybe further their efforts towards building a solidarity maybe between Palestinian and Jewish students, and maybe take into account the possible traumas that either side has?
I certainly think that colleges should consider the needs and the hurts and of all of their students, absolutely. And I also think that all forms of intergroup relationship should be cultivated. So I absolutely think that it is valuable for universities to be a place at which people of different background are encouraged and supported to intermingle, and in which universities are sensitive to all sorts of different groups. I would say, however, that this is not an answer to anti-Semitism. It's valuable in itself, but when there are anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses, they should not be taken as sort of a reason for, well, let's deal with bringing people. You've got to focus on the anti-Semitism and not just the intergroup conflict. So I would say yes, and maybe.
So do you think that certain groups like BDS are, other than like spreading anti-Zionist ideas, do you think that within that they're spreading anti-Semitic ideas, and that's only leading to more anti-Semites on campus?
I'm sure there's some of it in any social group. Much of the time within the BDS movement, one does not see explicit anti-Semitism. One sees implicit anti-Semitism. One sees that Israel and Zionism are used as a guise or concealment. It is a way of being able to attack the Jewish community without repercussions. Interestingly, one sees that to a lesser extent, but not unheard of, in the radical right as well. So you will see among neo-Nazis, for instance, to some extent, anti-Zionism is the language in which they communicate hatred of Jews, but they will also sometimes communicate hatred of Jews much more explicitly.
So do you think that students on campus have a good, clear way on how they can fight this anti-Semitism that's being brought upon them?
Well, that's a great question. I was wondering if you would ask me that one. Did that come from the audience?
No.
It's a good one. And if it's okay, I'm going to take a moment, because I do sometimes get asked, well, what can Jewish students do? And it's a difficult question, because it's one thing for adults to tell them to do something, and it's another thing for the students themselves to take a greater risk in taking on the fight. And I'll tell you, I have enormous respect for those who have the courage to speak out. And I know that not everyone does. So what I would say is that there are several things that I would suggest for those students who are thinking of responding in a significant way to what they see on campus. First recommendation I would have is maintain the moral high ground. I see students all the time who are pulled into battle by those who are really not of a high moral stature. And I think it's always important to maintain your sense of who you are, what you believe, and what you stand for. And that's not just the Jewish community, but it's also your values. Perhaps you would see them as your Jewish values. I would say start with that and make sure that in the heat of argument, that they don't get lost. Second, I would say stay safe. Physical safety isn't always an issue in these campus conflicts, but sometimes it is. And we have seen Jewish students being punched and injured and taken to the hospital. So I would say, if you're going to fight, be sure that you're fighting in a way that is safe. That is safe. Third, I would say, keep to your priorities. If you're in college or in high school, your goal is to graduate, to get your degree, to keep to your studies and make sure that your priorities are first. I would say stand tall. When it is safe to do so, speak your mind. That's part of being a good person. It's part of being a good citizen. And for many of us, it's part of what it means to live a Jewish life. I would say organize. Don't feel you have to be isolated. Work with others. I would say collaborate, not just with other Jewish students, but with other groups. It is very important to speak out when members of other groups are harmed. And it is also important to ask for their assistance when the Jewish community is harmed. Anti-Semitism and racism are not just attacks on Jews or, let's say, African Americans. They're attacks on all of us. And so we should speak out against all of them. I would say educate. The most important thing to be done is to make sure that people understand what is anti-Semitism, especially when it's connected to anti-Zionism. I would say laugh. I would say don't forget your sense of humor. Sometimes some of the best responses to anti-Semitic activity have been either to find some ways of keeping it light and keeping perspective. But then when you can safely and in an ethical and nonviolent way respond, do it. And try to make sure that the institutions that we enter are as strong when we leave as when we got there. That's what I would suggest.
Thank you. So what do you think a student should do if, like, school administrators decide to bring in a speaker who is anti-Semitic? And how should students react to this? And what should they do in terms of, like, addressing their administrators and possibly their peers?
Well, there are lots of different contexts, and it does make a difference if it's the speaker is brought in by other students or by faculty members, or in your hypothetical, by administrators. In some ways, it's worse when it's the administrators, because then it's not an exercise of academic freedom. It's an exercise of the institution expressing viewpoints, which in your example are anti-Semitic. I think it's important to do, as I just said, including speak out. And there are different ways of speaking out, and do it in conjunction with others. There may be organizations on campus like a Hillel or Chabad who would be able to help. There might be organizations off campus like Stand With Us, just to name one, but there are a number. In some cases, when it's more extreme than just speech, the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights would get involved. But I would also say that when it's the administration and not just the faculty or students, that is something where the Brandeis Center would certainly be concerned too.
So do you think that certain groups like If Not Now and J Street are helping the Jews on campus causes, or do you think that they are possibly hurting them?
Well, those are two different organizations, and they're different on the political spectrum. And J Street, at least, I think, has claimed to be a pro-peace but pro-Jewish organization, and I do think that there have been, at sometimes in some places, campuses where they have helped. Um, uh, the Vassar chapter of J Street pushed back a few years ago against a BDS effort. But too often, J Street, although it calls itself the pro-Israel group, isn't really on many campuses. It is, in fact, just another anti-Israel group, in effect, giving cover to the worst organizations.
And on the topic of If Not Now,
I'm not very familiar with them, but I've certainly never seen them do anything that I would consider to be helpful.
and so when looking for a college as a high schooler, what's like a good sign and what would be a bad sign for Jewish students?
Well, certainly Jewish students as students are going to be looking at a wide variety of different things. But I would look at things like availability of Jewish services. Is there a Hillel? Is there a Chabad? Is there a vibrant Jewish community? There are different sorts of Jewish students. Some of them are going to be looking for availability of kosher food, um, uh, availability of whatever sort of Jewish religious observance and services that one favors. I think one starts with the positive. What are the positive aspects of Jewish life on campus? If I'm interested in Jewish studies, do Jewish studies exist? Are there Jewish groups? And if so, are there a multiplicity of Jewish groups? Do they cover a wide variety of issues, including the ones that I'm looking for? But then beyond that, one should look to see, have there been anti-Jewish incidents? One could look at the website of the AMCHA initiative, AMCHA. The AMCHA initiative has a tracker on its website where you can look up to see incidents on campus and to see where they've happened. I wouldn't be necessarily scared away just because of one incident, depending on the nature of the incident, of course. But if there have been some, it would raise a flag.
And so how do you think maybe if if a Jewish student has like a peer who seems truly just uneducated about the topics of Israel and the topics of anti-Semitism, how should they educate their peers and make their peers like just understand the topics better?
Oh, well, that's a really good question also. I mean, it sort of depends on who you are and what you like to do. Working through a Jewish organization, a Jewish student organization, or Hillel, you might work to bring lecturers and films on campus, and perhaps bring your friend to a film or lecture or panel discussion on campus. You might introduce them to some of the organizations and books and ideas. There's some people who want to engage in dialogue and share in a reasonable way their ideas, and that's excellent too.
And so why do you think things like BDS ended up starting and ended up growing on college campuses?
I mean, the BDS movement has a long and controversial history. In a sense, They will say that they emerged from a call from Palestinian civil society to boycott Israel for certain specified goals that they have. But the fact is that the movement uh, really emerged not just from that civil society call, but really from much larger and better financed sources, going back to the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations at the Durban conference in 2001, which really recycled anti-Israel and anti-Jewish hatred that had been part of Israel boycotts for decades before that, stretching all the way back to the Nazi boycott of Jewish shops. In other words, there was a very long and ugly history of anti-Jewish boycotts that led up to the Durban conference and then through it to the call for civil society, a boycott. And it's very much international. It's very much driven by extremist organizations. It's been highly well funded, and it has spoken in recent years in a human rights language that has been palatable on the progressive left. Those who support boycotts of the Jews have changed their language, have changed their rhetoric from time to time. The means have been consistent. Throughout the entire history of the state of Israel, there have been continuous efforts to destroy it, including through boycotts of Israel and of Israeli business. But what has been highly successful of the BDS movement has been its ability to take this very old anti-Jewish hatred and to express it in a language which is compelling for, especially for the progressive community, which has become so influential on college campuses.
And what do you think maybe started the whole concept of anti-Semitism on college campuses in the first place?
Well, that certainly goes back a long time. In the United States, I think that we saw a first significant wave of anti-Semitism during the period when Jewish enrollment started increasing significantly in the 20s and 1930s. This was at a time when I think influential white Protestant people were starting to see their children rejected from highly competitive colleges that had really not been so competitive before. But they saw a wave of Jewish immigrants who were taking their places. So I think that it was really more the 20s, the 30s or so, where the rise of the Jewish student population because of immigration first led to that friction. So that was then. We then had really continuing problems of different sorts, tapering down over the decades, but never entirely going away. Now, with that still in the background, we have the emergence of the progressive anti-Semitism that, as I say, has been building since the onset of the Second Intifada.
So why do you think anti-Semitism on college campuses, excuse my poor choice of words, spreads like a virus?
Well, that's not a terrible choice of words. It does in some ways spread as a virus, and like a virus, it does mutate and change and adapt to circumstances, as anti-Semitism has over the decades. And I think with the anti-Semitism, what you have is an age-old form of hatred, which is culturally available. In the sense that when one is looking for a scapegoat, when one is looking for an other, when one is looking for someone to hate, there is an age-old stock of anti-Semitic stereotypes and defamations that one can latch onto.
So, do you think the Abraham Accords could affect campus anti-Semitism in any way?
Well, they should, shouldn't they? I mean, yeah, it's kind of ironic that the BDS movement is sort of the last to get the message. So much of the Arab world has started making peace with Israel, and I mean, it's such a marvelous time to try to celebrate and expand on those achievements. I have not seen any evidence. I'm not expecting any evidence that it would help. I do think that there has been evidence that when there are tensions in the Middle East involving Israel, when there's conflict, when there's war, that has often led to a spike in incidents on college campuses. So negative incidents definitely lead to a spike. And the fact that we haven't had those so much lately as in some prior years has been a good thing. But unfortunately, I'm not expecting positive incidents to have a positive correlation.
Hmm. And do you think that Jewish kids on campus, or even kids that support Israel, are afraid to like share their beliefs because of what their peers and educators and administrators might possibly think about them?
Well, some are, and I can't blame them because the fact is their professors are too. I mean, you would be surprised at how many professors one sees who are afraid to express their views. And you might, as a student, think, well, why would a professor be scared to express their views? It's not as if anybody's going to mark them down on their paper. It's not as if they're going to be, punished in the way that a student can be punished by a professor. And yet the professors all have their concerns. There are younger, untenured professors who are afraid to speak out before they get tenure. Then they get tenure and they think, well, I can't speak out for Israel and the Jewish community because I'm still an associate professor and I want to make full professor, and that's never going to happen if I speak out. Then they make full professor, and then they think, well, this is great, but I certainly can't rock the boat now. In a few years, maybe I'm online for a chair. Maybe I want to be invited to conferences. I want my papers to be accepted by prestigious journals. There are all sorts of ways in which there can be social repercussion against tenured professors. So what I've seen is that among professors, it's rare to see younger or even mid-career professors who have the courage to speak out before they go senior. They retire and then sometimes have the courage to speak out. But it's very hard for university professors to buck the trend and to have the courage to speak out. And so if they don't, how can we expect students will? And I get that, and there's no shame in focusing on things other than this. But there are so many students who do see this and who are awake to it and want to speak out. And I have to say, for them, I have great respect, and we should provide whatever support we can.
And do you think that maybe there's a sort of public school indoctrination of some sort that could lead to maybe more kids hating Israel and being anti-Semitic on campuses?
I think that there are all sorts of levels, all sorts of ways in which the indoctrination happens. Just to give one example, Middle East Studies programs under Title VI of the Higher Education Act were largely created in order to provide a pipeline of young college graduates who have language capabilities that would help them in the Foreign Service or in national intelligence. But what in fact has happened in recent years is that these programs often are one-sidedly anti-Israel and create through the Middle East Studies departments an indoctrination of their students in their classes, as well as an indoctrination through their federally funded programs on the campus for college students, and also in training of high school teachers, which sometimes leads to indoctrinations through the high schools as well.
And so, as our final question of today, the question that this whole entire summit was going to ask, do you think that college campuses are a breeding ground for anti-Semitism? And what steps should be taken to try to reverse this trend?
As I said from the beginning, I don't want people to be overly alarmist. And words like breeding grounds often create an impression that there is nothing but anti-Semitism on college campuses, when in fact, most college and university campuses have a wealth of healthy opportunities for Jewish students. And yet at the same time, I have to say, yes. The problem for college and universities is not only that they cultivate for many Jewish students a hostile environment during their 4 years there, but also as breeding grounds, in a sense, they seep into the broader environment. That is to say, the problem with campus anti-Semitism is not just that the students are harmed, but that in coloring and infecting the views of young people in a formative time of their life, is having a harm on society. And I would say that's one reason why, for those students who are thinking of becoming active, it's not just about how things are now on your campus. It's about how we are changing the world that we will live in and that we will pass on to the next generations. So yes, I would say that in many cases, college campuses have been a breeding ground for anti-Semitism, but that the opposite is true, which is that when we work together and when we fight back against it, they can also be a place from which we turn things around.
So thank you so much, Mr. Marcus, for your time today and answering all these questions and giving such great and educational answers for all of these. So just as a message for everyone who's still here, please don't forget to sign up for next week's summit with Tema Smith on ensuring Jews of color are heard in an inclusive Jewish community. And follow us on Instagram and Facebook, as well as the Gen Z Jews YouTube channel. And so once again, thank you, Mr. Marcus, for coming here and speaking. And thank you to everyone who came to watch. Thank you.
My pleasure.